Um, Thank you everyone for joining us in today's session. My name is Danielle Brooks. I am the marketing manager for Denver Public Library. I will be handing over this session to our very capable moderator, Mariana Esteves, and she will take it from here. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. First, welcome. Thank you all for joining us from all across. I don't know, you can share here on the chat where you're connecting right now. We'll start in a few minutes. I'll just give 2 more minutes for our other speaker to arrive. He's apparently having some technical issues, but I will be respectful of your time and give him like 2 more minutes. That sounds good. Yeah. I'll start then just introducing a little bit about the Margins Festival. Grab your tea, beer, kombucha, or wine and join us for this terrific conversation. We will turn audience for Q&A after around 20 minutes before the end. So if you have any questions, please add to the chat and Danielle will be helping us. I'm a cultural programmer at the Biennial of the Americas, a nonprofit based in Denver, Colorado, and we are honored to be here. We were invited by The Word, who is presenting Margins, a unique literary festival, conference, and book fair with deep commitment to our community, but it's also very concerned about opening doors to writers and paving bridges for local writers to the world. That's why they invited us from the Biennial of the Americas to curate a panel with authors across the Americas. The Margins, thanks Bianca and Susie Q, the amazing team behind this literary festival concerning showcasing poets, writers, and wordsmiths from the Margins, writers that are not on your mainstream bookshelf, but and bringing this amazing program. It's a very intimate literary festival, but very ambitious, and it couldn't arise in a more welcoming community. If you haven't been Denver, Colorado, please make sure to put that on your bucket list. The panel here today, Are You From Here or Over There, will feature authors whose voices echo battles over language, identity, borders, and belonging. Here today, I'm honored to introduce a group of brilliant poets, writers, and wordsmiths from across the Americas, so we can together navigate those multicultural margins. Ariana Lisboa from Brazil, Billy Ray Belcourt from Drifty Pile Cree Nation, and Manuel Eres from Mexico. We're still waiting for Manuel. I'm sure he will appear here, but we'll get started, okay? So I will start with Ariana Lisboa, uma conterrânea. We both come from Brazil. Adriana was born in Rio in the 70s. She has published, among other books, the novel Symphony in White, winner of the José Saramago Award, Crow Blue, chosen a Book of the Year by The Independent, and Hut of Fallen Persimmons, winner of a Japan Foundation Fellowship. She has also published poetry collections, short stories, and books for children. Her poems and stories have appeared in modern poetry in translation as Asymptote, Granta, and Revista Casa das Américas, among others. Adriana has a master in Brazilian literature and PhD in comparative literature from Rio de Janeiro State University. She was a visiting scholar at the International Research Center of Japanese Studies Nichibunken in Kyoto and at the University of New Mexico, as well as a writer in residence at the University of California, Berkeley. She has taught at the University of Texas, Austin at the Spanish and Portuguese department. A polyglot, she speaks Portuguese, English, Spanish, and French. She has lived in, and not only a polyglot, she has lived all over. She has lived in France, New Zealand, and United States, where she currently resides in Austin. Adriana, I'll start with you. You are ultimately a carioca, a girl from Rio. From an academic perspective, you would be considered a Latin American writer. But what I'm most interested at is how has your identity as a writer being shaped by being a polyglot and by living in so many different countries.
Well, thank you, Mariana, first of all, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully, Manuel will be able to join us. It will be an honor. Otherwise, happy to be here with Billy Ray as well. Well, thanks for the calling me that too. To be honest, I have been living outside of Brazil for over 15 years now. So I was thinking before joining this panel, I was thinking of this idea of margins and how does my work relate to that? And it kind of dawned, for me that even though I have lived in the US for almost 16 years and I am a US citizen, I still somehow manage to be in the margins, I'm a Latina, I speak with an accent, I am an author who writes in Portuguese, and I feel that it has always been expected from the books I have published in translation here.
Let me just check.
Yeah, all good? Okay. What was I saying? So the books that I have published in translation. So I'm a Brazilian author who still writes in Portuguese, even though I have lived abroad for a long time. The books that I have published in translation in the US and in other countries, I have the impression that it is always expected that I somehow would offer something about Brazil, some explanation, that I would be somehow, I don't know, some sort of interpreter of Brazil. This is very recurrent. And I am not that author, and I don't want to be that author. So it's kind of a ghost that follows us around, being from Brazil. When I'm in Brazil, I'm not expected to, explain the country to itself, but somehow being traveling with the books in other countries, there's always that kind of expectation. And maybe and the audience know that of everything that's published in the US, only 3% are works in translation. Maybe a little closer to 4% now, but that includes all books in translation. So if we're talking about literary fiction and poetry, which is my case, it's probably around 1% or less. So it's already a very marginal place in itself. And of course, it does shape the way one, looks at the world and looks at their own space in the world. But on the other hand, reflecting a little more about this idea of margins, today I was thinking about the great Italian author Primo Levi, who was a Jewish and a Holocaust survivor. And I was thinking specifically about one of his books that I really like, Periodic Table. And at some point he writes about impurities. He was also a chemist. So, and he says, I wrote it down here, he says, for the wheel to turn, for life to live, we need impurities. Even the soil, if we want it to be fertile, we need the sense, diversity, we need the grain of mustard and salt. And fascism, he says, doesn't want it, it forbids it, and that's why you're not a fascist. Fascism wants everyone to be the same, and you're not the same. So the margins are not really the margins, right? The margins are part of the essence, all that is non-conforming, unknown, unorthodox, invisible even, disobedient, rebellious. All of this is part of the fabric of culture. It's what makes cultures evolve. And no wonder, I was reading an article about this yesterday, conservatives always refer to the past. I think if we think of the slogan, Make America Great Again, let's go back to some better place and time, right? No, let's move forward to a new place and a new time which could include, all that is dissident, all that is different. And I came to recognize my space, whatever that is, even if it's that 1% right now here in this country, as part of that, that voice that is not, mainstream-ish, but that still has something to say in its own way and in its own language, with its own accent as well. So perhaps I can end this with a very brief poem that I think is kind of related to what I was trying to say. It's from a book called Pequena Música. It has been translated into English by Alison Entreking. And what I thought I could do was to read the very first few verses in Portuguese, so you can get to hear the language, and then I'll read the poem in English, in its English translation, and then we can go to the other speakers. So it's called Cafarnaum. Se não há Messias ou curandeiro à mão, dá jeito, levanta-te e anda, levanta-te e dança assim mesmo. So, Capernaum in Alison Entreking's translation. If there aren't any messiahs or shamans around, improvise, get up and dance anyway. Few will take the risk at this moment. The norms of composure are written in giant letters on the wall, but pretend you haven't seen them. Improvise, excuse yourself, make your own way, sidestep pep talks, primers, pulpiteers, calibrate your feet unimpeded for giddiness and dance. Thank you.
Thank you. That was beautiful, Adriana. You said something this week that moved me deeply when you said that it doesn't matter if you understand another language or not. Like, it sounds like meditating. Languages vibrate in different, vibrancy. And that's just beautiful to listen them in different languages, just for the sound, just for the music of it. And speaking of translating, Adriana has also connected us to Manuel Eres. Manuel Eres is the poet laureate from Cincinnati. He's originally from Mexico, and his work, I'll first go through his bio and then I'll give my take. Manuel, a Mexican poet living in the US, poet laureate from Cincinnati. He received the Merida National Award of Poetry in 2009 for his book, Notebooks of Dreams, and the Rodolfo Figueroa Regional Award of Poetry for his book, The Disguise of Fire. In 2016, 2 different anthologies of his poetic work were published, The Naked Light in Venezuela and Before the Mystery in El Salvador. His first bilingual anthology of poems, Traducir el Silencio, Translating Silence, was published in New York in 2018. This book won 2 different awards in the International Latino Book Awards in Los Angeles, California, in that same year. Iris has published poetry, essay, and translation in magazines and literary journals from Mexico, Spain, Chile, Cuba, Colombia, Portugal, France, and the US, and Angola. His poetry has been included in several Mexican as well as Latin American poetry anthologies. When you live for so long abroad like us, your national identity starts to change. Sometimes it gets stronger, in others it becomes something else, something it's hard even to define. When you, Manuel, were appointed as Cincinnati Poet Laureate, you read your poetry in both Spanish and English. How does your work with poetry, and that was like a big statement to me, like especially considering the relationship of these 2 countries. How does your work with poetry and translation help you to reconcile those feelings of belonging, both here and there?
Well, um, well, first, thank you for this invitation, Mariana, Adriana, Billy. I am very happy to share this panel with you. I think that the identity of any human being and the identity of a poet goes even beyond what we conceive as our identity. For example, I never felt more Mexican, to say something, than when I got to the United States. In Mexico, I was just a poet. Here, every time someone introduces me, I am introduced as a Mexican poet. And every time I read my poetry, I read it with an accent. And every time I read, I have to talk about translation. I have to do all of these other things that I didn't have to do there, where I wasn't different. That's what I miss. I remember that when I just got to the United States, I missed a lot of food, and I missed a lot, the certain streets, certain places. But now what I miss the most is not being different. What I miss the most is just to blend in, which is very difficult for me here in Cincinnati. Maybe if I live in the south of the United States, maybe if I live in California, but in Cincinnati, I do not blend in. So when I was named Poet Laureate of the city, it is also important to say that it was the year 2018. And in 2018, the anti-Mexican rhetoric coming from the presidency of the United States was vicious. And even though my poems are not political in the sense that I'm not talking about politics all the time, they became very political just because I look how I look and because they were in Spanish. So even if it was a love poem, if it was read in Spanish in an official event representing the city of Cincinnati, being a poet that at the time I was not even an American citizen, I was an immigrant poet with my green card representing an American city. So everything I did became a statement, despite even of myself, but I was happy to represent what I represented, because in that moment, just being what I am and doing the things I do was contradicting the definition of what a Hispanic, what a Mexican man was. Also, it was the same year that my daughter was born. And if becoming the Poet Laureate of Cincinnati became a change in the public arena of my life, in the intimate, in the domestic part of my life, the birth of my daughter made me change the way I thought about myself. Because if my daughter belonged to Cincinnati, she was born here. And I feel deeply that I belong to my daughter. So I didn't want to be a foreigner in her world. So I had to start adopting Cincinnati, and I had to start adopting the United States. And I had to get involved in its politics, and I had to get involved in the city, because that was the city of my daughter, and I refused to become a foreigner for her. Because the motherland, tu patria, as we say in Spanish, is the place where you belong. And in this case, I don't have a motherland. I feel that I have a daughterland, because I belong to my daughter and I want to be part of her world. Because we're talking about translation and these things, I want to read one poem that is called The Language of the House, which I think that is a poem that talks about translation and also about identity. And on reading this poem, which I'm going to read twice, it's a short poem. I'm going to read it in English and then in Spanish. I think that this poem expresses that complicated relationship with my new land, with this place, without ever denying that I come where I come from and that I am what I am. The Language of the House. I am, in this poem, I'm talking about my daughter learning to talk. And I was, like any other immigrant father, has been very worried about which languages she's going to talk. The language of the house. Sometimes I am afraid that you will talk in the language in which I cannot dream. I almost always wish that you will leave first the language of the house, the one in which I lull you to sleep, in which I imagine you telling me your things. You still do not know that there is a different music outside. Lately, I have been afraid of the months because you were born here, in this place, in this language in which I am a foreigner, and I want to live in your world, in the language that you will have within your words. I am afraid that you will also know the impossibility of belonging, but you will build your own homeland like anyone else. If someone asks you, where are you from? Tell them that you came from your father's heart, a heart that will learn any language to talk to you. Do I have time to read this in Spanish? I don't want to abuse.
Claro, claro, siempre.
El idioma de la casa. A veces tengo miedo de que hables el idioma en el que no puedo soñar. Casi siempre deseo que primero vivas el idioma de la casa, el mismo en que te arrullo, en el que te imagino platicándome tus cosas. Todavía no distingues que afuera hay otra música. Últimamente tengo miedo de los meses porque tú has nacido aquí, en este sitio, en este idioma en el que soy un extranjero y yo quiero vivir dentro de tu mundo, del idioma que tendrás, de tus palabras. Me da miedo que conozcas la imposibilidad de pertenecer, pero te harás tu patria como cualquiera. Si te preguntan de dónde eres, diles que has venido del corazón de tu padre, de un corazón que aprendería cualquier idioma para hablar contigo. So that is the conflict with my identity. The motherland is the place where you come from, the place where you belong to. And I personally think that I belong to everything I love. And I don't want to belong to anything that my daughter doesn't belong to.
Gracias, Manuel. Que bello, que rico. So your last poem, like it's the perfect link to introduce you to our last but not least, the amazing Billy Ray Belcourt. Our first two authors share the commonality of being aliens, immigrants in the US. If you ask them, they probably identify themselves as Latinos. Billy Ray walks a different path. The impulse to identify someone by the country they were born, it's like something natural, like he's Canadian. But Billy, his body of work goes exactly different direction as to denying his nationality that was imposed to him. I'll read first the bio of this exponent of Canadian, or how can I say, literature. Billy Ray Belcourt is a writer and academic from Drifty Pile Cree Nation. He's an assistant professor in the creative writing program at the University of British Columbia, a 2018 Pierre Heliot Trudeau Foundation Scholar. He earned his PhD in English at the University of Alberta. He was also a 2016 Rhodes Scholar and holds a Master in Human Studies from the University of Oxford and Wadham College. In the First Nations Youth category, Belcourt was awarded a 2019 Inspire Award, which is the highest honor the Indigenous community bestows on its leaders. He's the author of 3 books, This Wound is a World, NDN Coping Mechanism, Notes from a Field, and A History of My Brief Body. So Billy, what I'm very interested in learning is how, through your work with memoir, how do you approach this denial of your nationality, of this like common ground identity? but not only of that, but of your sexuality as well. Self-identifying is a very important part of your work, as I could perceive from reading one of your books. And I want to hear all about it, like how to work in this fragmented way, identity, margins. Thank you for being here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and to the other panelists as well. It's been so lovely to listen to your thoughts and your poems. I'm from the Durf Cree Nation, which is in Northwest Alberta on Treaty 8 territory. So my people for centuries have lived on the shores of a large body of water called Lesser Slave Lake. And on its shores in 1889, I believe, my ancestors signed a treaty with men who were sent this way, sent west by the infant Canadian government. That treaty was meant to be an ethical agreement, a way to harmoniously share the land. Alas, in the wake of that signing, the Canadian government carried out incredibly programmatic and brutal tactics that betrayed what is now called the spirit and intent of treaty. I say that I work now in the aftermath of that act of mistranslation. So at the time, of course, there was a government-appointed interpreter who had enough of a grasp of Cree, which is my ancestral language, but not an understanding that could capture the deeply philosophical register that the Cree language is situated in. So Canada, much like the US, is a country that begins with a series of crimes. It tries in many ways to absolve itself of those crimes, or to imagine and to try to bring about a future in which those crimes don't matter. I think that in my work, I attempt to both bring the impossibility of repair into focus, but also to imagine other worlds in which Indigenous flourishing is possible. For me, that's the work of the poetic as a modality of thought and art making, to act on the desire that another world is possible. I think that much of the work of anti-colonial literature, which is still developing in my country, in this country, is to make space, to carve out an emotional space where we as Indigenous people can feel like we are ungovernable or indomitable. I think that we have to insist on our unconquerability. It's a clunky word, but I think that it's the best word that we have right now. And so I'm doing that work alongside a number of Indigenous writers, both here and in the United States. And so, of course, that work is outside the confines of Canadian literature. And for many decades, Indigenous writing was actively suppressed in this country and is only very recently being celebrated. But I think that we as Indigenous writers have to hold on to the sort of non-institutional factor so as to not allow ourselves to be assimilated or co-opted. That's all I'll say for now. And I'll read one poem. It's a new poem, and it's called Autofiction. How we exist in the world depends on how we describe it. Have I always been in the world? No, I've been autumn in the middle of August. I've been the wind as well as the tamarack tree seconds after its final needles drop. Don't tell anyone, but I'm happiest when my life feels like autofiction. In Alberta, the 20th century never ended. We are all subjects of the 20th century, I say to a man I just met on the internet. It sounds like a riddle for which the answer is the body. Every winter, I take pictures of the snow because the snow reminds me of my impermanence. Mostly, I want to be undone without being ruined. An NDN truth, the present is as beautiful as it is brutal. Thank you.
So beautiful, Billy. It sounds like almost unfair, the question I'm posing to you all, like to define, identify, right? Describe if we're all impermanent and we're all fragments and we are all moving in this world and trying to belong or not belong anymore. So now what I want to propose is for the three of you, maybe share some more readings or ask questions to each other. Maybe the readings will enlighten more the conversation than like answering things. We all try to like make up answers for the questions that randomly come in our direction. So Adriana, do you want to share another reading so people can get to know more of your work, or poems that inspire you, or maybe even talk about other authors across the Americas that inspire you? An open flow right now.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I want to thank the other authors for their thoughts and readings. It was just wonderful to hear, and it's so inspiring to, to be in contact with different perspectives. Even though I was noticing that on the flyers that were the promotional material for this event, all the three of us, the three authors, are not looking directly at the camera. I thought that very interesting. Our gaze is, looking for something or going in other directions, and it can be, indigenous nation, it can be a home that doesn't exist and never will, it can be a family person, like Manuel said so beautifully about his daughter. And sometimes I think about my own son, who's now 24, but anyway, and also the country that I left being the home of my parents. But I lost my mother 8 years ago, and I lost my father last year. So it's like that land is also non-existent anymore, or it is existent, but it exists in my heart, and it exists in who I am, but in a completely changed and different ways. So we're always redefining, re-signifying that idea of belonging and what kind of community we build. I would love to read a poem actually by Manuel. I discovered browsing online a while ago, I discovered Manuel's work and I fell in love with it. And I translated a few of his poems into Portuguese. They were published in a literary newspaper in Brazil recently. And there is a poem by him that is perfect for me for this meeting. It's called Clarification in English. And he wrote, I think he wrote it in Spanish and translated into English. I know I have a bilingual book with both versions, and I know they're both his. I would love to know if they wrote first in Spanish and then
I
translated.
always write first in Spanish.
Okay.
The poem never
Yeah.
comes to me in English.
Right. Yeah,
Just
I
always
thought
translate.
so. I thought so. So I'm going to read it in English, but I would love to read the first few verses in Spanish and then in Portuguese, so we can have all the three languages here. So in Spanish it goes aclaración. So this is a Brazilian Spanish accent, different kind of thing. Es mentira que los árboles desconocen el mundo. Un árbol viaja por medio de sus pájaros y también viaja hacia adentro al hundir sus raíces. In Portuguese it goes, é mentira que as árvores desconheçam o mundo. Uma árvore viaja por meio de seus pássaros e também viaja para dentro ao afundar suas raízes. And then the whole poem in English, clarification. It's a lie that trees do not know the world. A tree travels by virtue of its birds and also travels inward when sinking its roots. It all makes sense. Nothing is more fixed to the earth than a tree. Nothing moves more through the air than a bird. It is a fruit that flies. And poetry is the fact that they need each other.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you, Manuel. Having that beautiful voice reading your poems.
Now I'm only gonna have Adriana reading my poems.
Yes, her voice is like, it's like a drug.
I love this. I love this idea. I mean, I love this idea of a fruit that flies. And when we talk about belonging, the metaphor of the tree and the roots it's unavoidable almost. And the solution that Manuel found in this poem is just amazing, with the fixity of the tree, but the movement of the bird, and the two of them living together and being together, and something that carries, you know, the it's like the bird carries the root through the air, like this idea of a fruit that flies.
I'm going to confess you that for me, that poem is more of an ars poetica. It's a poem about poetry. But this reading that you're doing about belonging, about traveling, right? About the birds that go even though the tree stays, it's a new reading for me. I never read my poem in that way.
Do you like it? Do you like this reading?
I love it. I love it. But I never thought about this poem as a poem that could be a metaphor of migration. And I guess I never thought about it with my head. But when you say it, I see the image so clearly that I cannot deny that it's there. So maybe I thought about it with my heart only, but not with my head when it was happening.
Manuel, I have one question. These days, when you write a poem, do you write it first in Spanish or in English? And do you go back and forth, like changing if
that is the thing. English is much more economical than Spanish. The images are more brief, and Spanish has this very beautiful sound closer to Portuguese. And sometimes when I write only in Spanish and only thinking in Spanish, I start repeating words and looking words because of how they sound. And then when I start translating my work and I translate that wordplay, that wordplay makes no sense. So sometimes I like the very succinct poem in English. I like the simplicity of the English version of the poem, and I go and I change the original. So translating has become part of my editing process now. The poem is not finished until I translate it, because during the translation, I start changing the original. So English has become part of my editing process, but the poem so far, I don't know if this will happen later. I don't know if it will happen tonight. I don't know. But so far, a poem has never come to me in English. I don't know if it will happen.
And Billy, what language do they originally spoke at Drift Pile Cree Nation? And do you know some of it? Did you grow up hearing some of those sounds? How do they impact on your awareness of language, on your philosophical notions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the language, my people's language is called Cree, and there are a number of nations who speak it in Canada, across mostly the central and northern parts of the country. There was Cree in my childhood, mostly spoken by my grandfather. So I know bits and pieces of it. And I also know that it is a language that allows people to inhabit the world differently than we do in English. I think, for example, at this moment when I was with my grandfather and my grandmother, and an acquaintance of his came by and they were talking to one another in Cree. And when he left, I asked what he said. And my grandfather said that he wasn't quite sure because he mumbled the end. So Cree is a language in which the meaning is built into the word. And so each part of the word matters. There's some linguistic phrase for that. I can't remember it right now. But it made me think, how differently things would be if, we all had to treat language with that much care, because I think that it would change how we treat one another. English is so blunt and ugly. It is economical. And it almost feels like a stroke of luck that we can still, make poems with it.
I love it.
Billy, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I am from the Yucatan in Mexico. That's where I was born. Mm-hmm. Largely, the Mayan language is still largely spoken, not in the main cities, but the farther you go from the main cities of the state, the more and more bilingual Mayan Spanish, and even monolingual, only Mayan, the farther you go from the metropolis. But in my case, for example, the mother of my grandmother spoke fluently Mayan. My grandmother understood it, but didn't speak in that fluently. Because in her generation, it was punished at school to speak Mayan language. So she didn't even try to teach it to the generation of my mom. And then I am the second generation. My mom only speaks Spanish. There was the one, and I, 2 generations removed from Mayan, I speak English and Spanish. So I didn't only didn't receive the Mayan, but I also adopt a different colonial foreign language, right? But for example, my poetic practice resembles the one of the Mayan poets. Because they don't have translators. A Mayan poet writes in Maya, and then they translate themselves into Spanish. They don't wait for the translator, because if they wait for the translator, it will never be published. And imitating them is that I decided to be my own translator. instead of looking for translators.
Mhm.
Has this phenomenon happened? Is there poetry in your people's language that is published in that language and read in that, like, is there, because
Mhm.
I am still a Mexican poet, you see what I mean? And I am a poem of Mayan descent, but there are the Mayan poets that have a different imagery and a different tone than me. Does that also happen with you, with your people?
Mhm. I know of one poet who publishes in both Cree and in English. Her name is Louise Half. And then I know other poets or other indigenous poets will write in their ancestral language, and then it will be translated into either French or English. So French is also one of the national languages of Canada. But I think how I've thought about this, the problem of only speaking in the language of, colonial conquest, is that I think through poetry I can replicate, however poorly or messily, some of the philosophical vitality of my ancestral language, and maybe even try to enact that, ethic of, communality that my ancestors brought to the signing of treaty.
Thank you.
It makes me think of things that languages do sometimes, and how we relate to them, and the kind of I don't know, the kind of place that they come to occupy in our languages. I was never able to write in Portuguese, in English myself, just like Manuel. I don't even translate myself. I'm not able to do that. But as the two of you were speaking, I was thinking of the Romanian poet Paul Celan, who was a survivor of the Holocaust and who was imprisoned in Nazi camps, and who wrote in German. And he became one of the most prominent European poets in the post-war period, and writing in the language of the enemy. So that's quite, and the poetry that he did is just so amazingly beautiful and so difficult at the same time. So it's like, I don't know, maybe we can think of language as something that we can also transform through our life with it. So I know that my English, for instance, is not any English, is an English learned by and lived by someone who comes from a different country, a different culture, who's also a translator. So in that way, we kind of appropriate, I don't know, the Cuban author, José Lezama Lima, whom I've translated, he had this wonderful idea of a counter conquest. So the Americas, through their literature, and he was a very Baroque kind of poet, through that in itself was a gesture of conquer, using that which came to us, and even that language, to do something else and to produce something else that can only happen in America. And in our cases, can only happen in the specificities of our own lives and places.
When you were mentioning Lezama Lima, when you said Cuban author, I immediately thought, because of what you were explaining, on one essay by Roberto Fernández Retamar called Caliban. And in this essay, he gives the example of this character in The Tempest by Shakespeare called Caliban, which is this indigenous person from the Caribbean that is taken back to Europe. But he learns the language And at some point, he curses back, their masters in English, because now he owns the language. And that is what has happened in every colony, right? Now this language is also ours. So now you have to hear us. And the act of existing becomes a political act, just like what I was saying at the beginning, just being there and being called Manuel and have this skin color as the poet laureate, that is a political act. Even if I don't do anything, even if I don't read the poem, even if I say I don't want the poem and I walk out, that is a political statement. There is no way to not be a political statement when you are some kind of diversity. And I think that at the end, we, the three of us, are somehow of the same motherland. And if there was, and it's the same motherland that Primo Levi was, or that Paul Celan was, which is writing itself. Poetry. At the end of the day, I believe that what defines me, and this is maybe just me and my interpretation of who I am in the universe, I believe that if there is a God, if there is a creative force that made us, I believe that that force said, I'm going to make a poet. And then everything else was made. Then that force decided that I was going to be born in Mexico, that I was going to be short and have curly hair and all of that. Then it was after that that he decided that Adriana was going to be so eloquent, and Billy was going to have that beautiful voice with which he reads his poems, But I am a poet. And I believe that defines me more than being Mexican and than being, brown-skinned and etc. So at the end, I think that we, being poets, we belong. First, maybe sometimes I believe that I belong to my language, but then I believe that I belong to something that is beyond language, which is poetry itself. Because we all have heard that misquote of Robert Frost that says that poetry is what gets lost in translation. I think I cannot disagree more. I believe that poetry is precisely what survives the translation. I have never read Wisława Szymborska in Polish. And is still one of the poets that have more deeply impacted my poetic life. I have never read Greek tragedies in Greek, but still, they still hurt. I have never read the Mayan poets in the Mayan language, but something survives that translation, and that's something that is the language beyond language, is what poetry is, I think. I believe that poetry is a translation of silence. I have said that many times. Poetry is finding words to say what we cannot say with words. Therefore, poetry is beyond words. We have to use words because that's our tool. But poetry is beyond language. I believe that the three of us, from Brazil and Canada and Mexico, we are citizens of the same place. But that place is something beyond territories and even beyond language. It's poetry.
I love this. And art has this ability to transcend, right? To gives us permission to challenge all these identities, to go beyond borders, visas, walls, and all these crazy things upon us. So now I think I want to open for, I think there is Tina, do you want to ask a question? I will open up for you to talk here. I believe you have a question for the authors. Hello, Tina? You have to unmute. Tina?
She just unmuted.
Yeah, she raised her hand, but maybe she doesn't have a question. Okay, Tina, if you have a question, just pop it up here. Thank you. So does anyone else want to give another reading or ask another question to one another? or maybe I have a good exercise. I would love for each of you to mention one or two authors from your home country that you admire and that you think it's worth others knowing. Billy?
Yeah, I will say Joshua Whitehead, an OG queer novelist. His most well-known work is called Johnny Appleseed. It's a novel. And also another poet, Matthew James Weigel, who just published a book called White Mud Walking, about working in colonial archives, trying to still be human.
Thanks. Manuel, any authors from Mexico or other?
Yes, I'm going to mention two authors from Mexico. One, her name is Coral Bracho. Coral Bracho is a very recognized Mexican poet, and I love her because of her delicacy. She's a very delicate, very almost ethereal poet. She's talking about very important things, but the song in her poems just carries you away. I am not used to read really long poems. I often like shorter poems, but she can write for 7, 8, 9 pages, and it sounds like a lullaby. It just lets you go, and she makes these poems that go ascendant. It's a beautiful poem. There is another woman called Gloria Gervitz. Gloria Gervitz is an also Mexican poet. She's of Jewish descent, and she wrote one book in her life. It is a book that kept growing like a tree. She just added more and more chapters to this book throughout her life. And the name of this book, this one book, is Migrations, Migraciones. And the migrations of Gloria Gervitz are all kinds of migrations, like migrations from this world to the next world that we don't know what it is. These are migrations from the silence to the word. These are migrations from the darkness into the light, from the dark into from the known to the unknown, all kinds of migrations. And this book, which is very interesting, I believe it's a very interesting poetic project. This book just kept growing. It's just one, she wrote only one book, but she published like Migrations, Migrations 2, Migrations 3, etc. And it was really chapters. It was not new books, because every new migrations had the past migrations and continue expanding on. And then she made revisions to the older chapters. So it was a book that was constantly changing. It was growing organically, like a plant. It's a very interesting poet. And then it's this one man that I admire a lot. He's younger. His name is Jorge Fernández Granados. Jorge Fernández Granados is a poet that I admire too very much. He's a poet that writes with a lot of intuition, but you can tell that his intuition never gets lost. He also writes with a lot of intelligence, and he's got a great sense of ear. He's always choosing the right word in the right place, and he talks a lot about childhood, which is a theme that I'm currently going back. So he always is reinterpreting moments in his childhood. Like, when this happened, when I killed this ant, I didn't know that I was learning about death, blah, blah, blah. So he's constantly going back to moments of his childhood now as an adult, and seeing a new reading in those. So these 3 poets, I would say, I admire very much.
Thank you, Manuel. Adriana, any Brazilian authors crossing your mind?
Yeah, I would love to recommend 2 indigenous authors. They are not poets, but their name, I believe they are translated into English. One of them is Davi Kopenawa Yanomami, from the Yanomami tribe. and the other is Ailton Krenak from the Krenak tribe. And Davi Kopenawa has a wonderful, just I think essential even book called The Fall of the Sky. And one of many of Ailton Krenak's books is called Life Isn't Useful. That would be my translation into English. A vida não é útil. And those two authors, they have been very vocal and very important in Brazil right now to help reshape what the country thinks about itself. You know, we had a movement in recent years that was very similar to what happened in the US with Donald Trump. We still have our own Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro. And with that power, many people are looking for answers in other places and in different places. And we are in many ways recovering our African and indigenous roots. So for instance, the knowledge of the indigenous peoples, or even the spiritual practices of indigenous peoples, as possible alternatives to the chaos and the complete catastrophe that Brazil has become. So that's a very beautiful movement to witness and to follow. And I think those two authors are absolutely essential in that direction, to move in that direction and to understand options to, the far right catastrophic status quo of Brazil right now.
Thank you, Adriana. I want to thank you all. First, thank Billy, Manuel, Adriana for joining us, being so generous of your time and knowledge. This is amazing. Saturday, let's all turn this computer off. Thank you for joining us for the first Biennial Margins panel. We hope you enjoyed hearing from our speakers. Support the authors, go buy the books. Thank you, Vinyanka and Susie Q, for the invitation to curate this panel. The Biennial is honored and looking forward for many more opportunities. If you're lucky enough to be here in Denver, please make sure to check the program at McNichols Building. There is an amazing book fair, so many panels, a dance party, and movies on the lawn. But if you're not, there is also a virtual conference going on, and you all be able to stream those later. So spread the word. Stay tuned for all the good things to eat, listen, and dance from the Americas at the Biennial of the Americas newsletter, biennialoftheamericas.org, for all the things from the Americas in Denver, Colorado. Have fun, it's Saturday. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.